Hey, it's Dr. Christopher. And if you've been hearing a strange ringing, buzzing, hissing, or humming sound in your ears that nobody else around you can hear, I need you to stop scrolling right now, because what I'm about to tell you might explain why it never seems to go away and why so many people in their 40s, 50s, and 60s are dealing with this quietly, almost embarrassed to even bring it up to their own doctor, worried that if they mention it out loud, someone will think something is seriously wrong with them, when really, this is one of the most common and most misunderstood issues in all of hearing health. And almost nobody talks about it openly, even though it's affecting people all around you right now. Maybe even someone sitting next to you, someone at your church, your gym, your workplace, quietly nodding along to conversations while a phantom sound plays in the background of their entire life. This condition is called tinnitus, and according to hearing researchers at institutions like Johns Hopkins and the National Institute on Deafness and Other Communication Disorders, it's estimated that somewhere between 1 in 10 and 1 in 5 adults will deal with some form of it in their lifetime, which means if you're hearing that sound right now, you are far from alone, even though it can feel like the loneliest, most maddening thing in the world at 3 in the morning when the house is silent, and that ringing is the only thing you can hear. Louder than your own thoughts, louder than the ticking clock, louder than anything else in the room, and the worst part is how invisible it is because nobody else can hear it, nobody else can prove it's real, and that alone can make people feel like they're losing their mind a little. Now here's something that might genuinely surprise you. Tinnitus itself is not really a disease. It's a symptom, kind of like a fever is a symptom of an infection rather than the illness itself. And that's actually good news because it means there's almost always something underneath it that can be identified, understood, and in many cases improved, instead of just something you're forced to silently live with forever, which is exactly what a lot of people assume the moment they get told there's no cure. Some of the most common culprits are years of exposure to loud noise, whether that's from concerts back in your 20s and 30s, a loud workplace, power tools, lawn equipment, motorcycles, or even just years of high volume through earbuds on your daily commute. And that kind of noise exposure can quietly damage the tiny hair cells inside your inner ear that are responsible for sending sound signals up to your brain. And once those hair cells are damaged or worn down, your brain sometimes starts filling in the gaps with phantom sound, almost like static on an old television screen, which is what you experience as that constant ringing or hissing that never seems to fully switch off. Other common causes include something as simple as earwax buildup, which sounds almost too basic to be a real answer, but genuinely accounts for a shocking number of tinnitus cases that clear up almost immediately the moment the wax is properly removed by a doctor, along with natural age-related hearing loss, high blood pressure, poor circulation, jaw and TMJ tension from clenching or grinding your teeth at night, certain medications like high-dose aspirin or specific antibiotics that are known to affect hearing, too much caffeine, nicotine, or sodium in some sensitive people, and even chronic day-after-day stress, since stress hormones circulating through your body can make your entire nervous system more sensitive to every signal it receives, including the faint background noise your inner ear normally tunes out completely without you ever noticing it. There's a specific nerve involved here called the vestibulocochlear nerve, or the 8th cranial nerve, and it runs from deep inside your skull near the brainstem all the way out to your inner ear, carrying both your sense of hearing and your sense of balance at the same time. And when there's irritation, inflammation, or any kind of disruption anywhere along that pathway, your brain can misinterpret the incoming signal as a constant tone, buzz, or hiss, even though there's no actual outside sound causing it at all, which is exactly why some people can have completely normal hearing tests and still hear that sound every single day. Now, before we go any further, let's take a quick pause because if this description sounds exactly like what's happening to you, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me how loud your ringing is on a scale from 1 to 10, because honestly, watching all of you argue in the comments about whose ears are ringing louder is the closest thing I get to real entertainment some days, so don't disappoint me. Okay, back to it. There's a home technique that's gotten pretty popular online where people gently tap or flick their fingers near the base of the skull, right around that bony ridge behind the ear, roughly at ear level, the idea being that a light, rhythmic tapping motion near where that 8th cranial nerve exits the brainstem might help reset the abnormal signal your brain is receiving. I want to be completely honest with you here because I'm not going to feed you false hope just to keep you watching. There is no strong clinical research proving this tapping method cures tinnitus, and it certainly does not work for everyone, but it is harmless, it costs you nothing, it takes less than a minute, and plenty of people online say they've noticed the ringing feels a little quieter afterward. So if you want to give it a shot, gently place your middle finger just above that bony ridge behind your ear. Let your index finger flick down against it in a light, controlled tapping motion. Do that for about 20 taps, then pause and notice whether the ringing feels any different, and if it does shift even slightly, you can repeat it for a few more rounds throughout the day, And if it doesn't do anything for you at all, that's completely normal too. So don't panic and don't assume that means nothing else will help you. What actually has solid, well-documented evidence behind it, though, is something called sound therapy, which is simply introducing a gentle, steady background noise like a fan, a white noise machine, or soft nature sounds, especially at night, because your brain tends to notice the ringing most when everything else around you is completely silent, and giving your brain something else to gently focus on can make a real, noticeable difference in how disturbing that sound actually feels, even if the ringing itself hasn't fully disappeared. There's also an approach called tinnitus retraining therapy, which combines this kind of sound masking with counseling, and it's specifically designed to help your brain slowly learn to tune the sound out, the same way it already tunes out things like your own breathing or your clothes touching your skin. And while it takes patience, usually several months of consistency, many people report a real, lasting reduction in how much the ringing bothers them day to day. Hearing aids can also help enormously if some degree of hearing loss is part of the picture, since restoring outside sound often reduces how loudly the brain turns up the phantom ringing in the first place to compensate for what it's missing. And for people whose tinnitus is tied heavily to stress, anxiety, or poor sleep, cognitive behavioral therapy has shown real, measurable results in helping people feel far less bothered and distressed by the sound, even in cases where the sound itself doesn't fully go away. And that distinction matters more than most people realize, because so much of the day-to-day suffering with tinnitus comes from the fear and frustration wrapped around it, not simply the noise itself. And here's the part that might genuinely change how you think about this whole condition. Many hearing specialists now believe that lowering your stress response and improving your sleep quality can reduce the perceived volume of tinnitus almost as much as some medical treatments do, simply because your nervous system is so tightly linked to how loudly your brain plays that phantom sound in the first place, which means the anxious spiral so many people fall into, lying awake at night, panicking about the ringing, searching worst-case scenarios online at midnight, may actually be making the ringing feel far louder and far more permanent than it really is, turning a manageable annoyance into something that quietly takes over someone's entire life. Let me tell you about a woman I'll call Linda, because her real name isn't important here, but her story might feel very familiar to some of you. Linda was in her late 50s, recently retired, finally with time to enjoy her mornings with coffee out on the porch, when a high-pitched ringing showed up out of nowhere just a few days after a head cold. At first, she assumed it would fade within a few days like everything else usually did, but weeks passed and the ringing stayed put. And worse, it seemed to grow louder every single night once the house went completely quiet. She stopped sleeping well, started avoiding quiet rooms altogether, kept the television running just for background noise even when she wasn't watching it, and eventually even skipped a family gathering because she was too embarrassed to admit that a sound only she could hear was quietly ruining her mood and her patience with everyone around her. It wasn't until she finally saw an audiologist, got fitted with a small sound therapy device for nighttime use, and started practicing simple, slow breathing exercises before bed that things genuinely began to shift. Not overnight, but gradually. Week by week, the ringing stopped being the loudest thing in the room. Her sleep slowly came back, and she told me later that the moment she stopped fearing the sound was almost the exact same moment it stopped controlling her days, her mood, and her sense of peace at home. I've also heard from a man named Robert in his early 60s, a retired mechanic who assumed his ringing was just part of getting older after decades of working around loud engines, and he never once mentioned it to a doctor until his wife finally convinced him to get his hearing checked, and it turned out a simple pair of hearing aids, combined with cutting back on his nightly 2 cups of strong coffee, made a noticeable difference within just a few weeks, which goes to show that sometimes the fix is far simpler than people assume, and it often has nothing to do with some rare, mysterious problem and everything to do with small, ordinary habits nobody ever thought to question. There's one more thing I want you to hear clearly because it could genuinely matter. Most tinnitus is what's called subjective tinnitus, meaning only you can hear it, and while it's usually not dangerous on its own, there are a few warning signs that mean you should see a doctor sooner rather than later instead of waiting around. And those are if the ringing shows up suddenly in only one ear, if it comes along with sudden hearing loss or dizziness, or if the sound has a rhythmic pulsing quality that matches your own heartbeat, because that specific pattern, sometimes called pulsatile tinnitus, can occasionally point to a blood flow issue that's worth having checked out properly rather than assumed away. On a more everyday level, plenty of people find real relief just from small, low-cost habit changes, like using a free white noise app on their phone at night instead of buying anything expensive, keeping a small fan running in the bedroom, cutting back on late afternoon caffeine if you notice your ringing spikes in the evening, staying well hydrated, and simply giving your ears regular breaks from earbuds and loud environments so they're not constantly under stress on top of everything else. So, if you're dealing with anything like this, please don't just quietly suffer through it for years, the way so many people do, out of pride or embarrassment. Talk to an audiologist or your doctor sooner rather than later. Rule out simple things like earwax buildup or high blood pressure. Try sound therapy at night, starting tonight if you can. Cut back on excess caffeine or nicotine. If you notice a pattern, protect your ears from loud noise going forward, and give that gentle tapping technique a shot since it costs you nothing and takes less than a minute. But please don't rely on it alone as your entire plan. This is Dr. Christopher, and if this video helped you understand what's actually happening inside your ears, do me a favor and share it with someone in their 40s, 50s, or 60s who's been quietly dealing with this exact thing in silence, because there's a good chance they've never heard any of this explained so clearly and simply before, and I'll see you in the next one.